welcome to Post-Colonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and today I'll briefly talk about one concept by Achille Mbembe from his book on the post-colony, and it's called The Habits of Democracy. Now, I had just recently recorded it for my Urdu channel, and I realized it doesn't exist on this channel. So in his book on the post-colony, what Mbembe, besides so many other things, is discussing is what kind of a system develops generally under colonialism. And then, in turn, what do the post-colonies inherit? And one of the things that he talks about is what he calls commandment, right? And what he means by that is that most of the times, the colonial system works through developing a hegemony, right, through dispensations, through salaried work, right? But the system itself is undemocratic. It's top-down. And it's not participatory democracy. And in my understanding, what that ends up doing is, as people are existing under colonialism, they do not develop the habits of democracy. So what are the habits of democracy? A belief that you are citizens of a democracy and you have certain rights, that you also have certain obligations, that the civil servants who work in the government work for you, that they are your servants, and that the civil servants themselves adopt a way of thinking where they think of themselves as servants of the people. And this has huge implications for the post-colonies. Now, Achille Mbembe discusses it within the African context. But if you look at India and Pakistan, now the colonizers leave and we are left with huge populations who have neither been educated but also who have not thought of themselves as citizens of a democracy. And we are still, at least in Pakistan, still struggling with that. That is why so many times the military dictators have found sympathetic responses, not because people are subservient, but the way of thought has not been trained to be democratic. Now, if you were a citizen of a democracy, you will be appalled at that because you've internalized the logic that as people, you elect your leaders and then let them govern you, right? Similarly, if you look at the infrastructure or the structure of the civil services in Pakistan, it's still the same. You know, every district has a federally appointed or a provincially appointed administrator. They are not elected. They are not responsive to the people, right? They consider of themselves as elite, as above people, right? And we haven't been able to replace it with a system of government where local governments are run by representatives that people themselves have elected. So what's the difference then? The difference is if those are elected people by you, you will have no qualms about walking into their office and saying, you know, my drain needs fixed, our street is not being cleaned. But the deputy commissioner who is responsible for your district, you won't have access to his office. If you walked up there, there'll be 3 or 4 layers of other civil servants who serve him controlling your entry. So that's the difference. And then not having the habits of democracy is accepting that as the norm. Same with the police forces. So one huge impact of colonialism then is that while in Europe, civil rights and laws are being developed over 200 years, when the colonizers hold the colonies, the same habits of democracy, modes of thinking are not developing, right? And hence, a literal act of getting the freedom doesn't immediately solve all problems because we have lost all that time, right? While the Europeans were developing their cultures, their democracies, their political systems, we were being governed by an archaic mode of top-down system of government that develops our consciousness and that gives us the ways of thinking the government and thinking our lives in it. So one layered struggle in the post-colony is then developing an educational system, a system of awareness where people know that they are citizens of a democracy, they have rights, they can have certain expectations from their government and their government servants, and that they have certain obligations to each other, to the state, and to the nation. Now, that happens only if we can develop an educational system that incorporates that in the civic education. But sadly, the problem gets further aggravated because we also inherited the educational system. So if you look at traditional educational system that we inherited from the British in India and Pakistan, it relies on rote memory. It relies on reproduction of learned knowledge in a test. It doesn't encourage critical thought. It doesn't encourage critical consciousness. So these are some of the ramifications of colonization. And the reason Mbembe goes there and tries to explain this concept of habits of democracy is that what he's trying to explain in his book on the post-colony is the problems that the colonies face, post-colonies face, post-colonial nation states face after they've achieved their independence. Because most of the times in the Western press and even by Western academics, those countries are represented as failure. Look, we left and look what happened to them. And what he's trying to trace is what are the intellectual and structural, what is that baggage that we bring from a colonial state to a free and independent nation state, and not having developed the habits of democracy over 100, 200 years that you were colonized is one big problem that most post-colonial nation states have to resolve. And that requires a restructuring of the political system, of the economic system, of the system of government functioning, but also educational. And think about that then, how massive a change is needed to develop citizens who think of themselves as citizens of a democracy with the accruing rights from that, but also the obligations and responsibilities that they have as citizens of a democracy. So I thought these would be useful thoughts to those of you who work on post-colonial nation states and their systems, but also if you're a student of post-colonial studies. I hope this helps. Let me know what you think. Thank you so much, and as always, peace and love.